Hey, everybody, it's me, Jeff Urbin, your old pal here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, speaking to you live from said location, right here in beautiful downtown Hyde Park, New York, in the Hudson Valley on a beautiful spring day. So today happens to be May 8th, and if you're watching this, years from now, just imagine it's May 8th. And May 8th happens to be Harry Truman's birthday. Yes, today is Harry Truman's 140th birthday. If he had just taken a little bit better care of himself, but what are you going to do? Now, Harry S. Truman, and the S can have or doesn't have to have a period. The S in Harry S. Truman doesn't stand for an actual singular name. What it stands for is his two grandparents, Grandpa Ship and Grandpa Solomon. So since it doesn't really count for a word, you can use it either way. So you can chat with your friends about that. Now, Harry S. Truman went on to have a pretty successful career. As the 33rd president of the United States, and then won re-election, and all that sort of stuff. And that's fine. That's dandy, right? That's good. Good for you, Harry. But here in the land of Roosevelt, Harry Truman's big claim to fame is having been FDR's third, the one that then became president. Now, those of you who know your stuff are saying, wait a minute now, didn't FDR have 4 terms? How could Harry Truman be the third vice president and then still end up being president? And the reason for that is that John Garner was the vice president for the first 2 terms, and then Henry Wallace, and then Harry Truman. And we're going to get into all that here in a second. But before we do, let's have a little word about the vice presidency, okay? The job of vice president was actually created in the Constitution. And if you look in your Constitution and you go over to Article 2 in Section 1 of the Constitution, and it's laid out right there. And then it is also vaguely described in the next 4 or 5 clauses that follow that. So go to your Constitution. Article 1, of course, about the Congress, legislature. Article 2 is the presidency and vice presidency, and Article 3 is the discussion there about the Supreme Court. So we find the vice presidency in the Constitution, and it consisted primarily of 2 tasks, as it's laid out here, right? So the first task is to call the Senate every morning and see if there are any tie votes that need to be decided, right? If it's anything in a tie, 50-50, 25-25, whatever, then the vice president would come in and cast the deciding vote. So the first thing you do is call the Senate in the morning and say, hey, any tie votes that need to be cast, broken? All right. And then the second thing is call the White House and make sure that the president is still alive. So if you call the White House and the president picks up the phone, then you're good. And if the answer to the first question is no tie votes, and the answer to the second question is yes, the president is still alive, then the vice president is essentially constitutionally able to stay in his jammies the rest of the day and go back to bed. When I say he, and of course, in this day and age, we actually have a woman vice president. So that's awesome. Now, I'm kind of kidding, right? You don't really get to stay in your jammies and, call it a day. But for a long, long time, that's kind of what it was. Right? My kidding there would really only be sort of slightly. Officially, the vice president is the president of the Senate and has the duty to preside over the Senate. But historically, that has been done by the majority leader. And the reason for that is because the vice president is really technically part of the executive branch. And so it's kind of weird to have an executive branch guy sitting there running things in the half of the legislative branch. So traditionally, the vice president hasn't really done that, except for the tie casting part of that as well. So there really wasn't a whole lot for the vice president to do. It's not really, hasn't been historically an exciting job. In fact, so dismal is the job of being vice president that it was described by the nation's very first vice president, John Adams, by saying this. He said, and I quote, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever in the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Okay, not a real good endorsement for that. In fact, FDR's first vice president, right, John Garner, he once described the vice president's office as not being worth a bucket of spit. Just between you and me, spit wasn't the word that he used. So originally, you got to be vice president simply by coming in second for president, right? So they set this thing up, say, okay, whoever gets the most votes, you get to be president. The guy comes in second place, you get to be the vice president. But they soon realized that this was not a good idea, and it was not a good idea for a couple of reasons. Number one is the two folks that had been fighting to become president were rivals, and the idea was that they were fighting to become president because they had alternative ideas on how to do things. So if one of them becomes president and the other guy becomes vice president, then you have two folks with conflicting ideas trying to run the country, and that's not going to work so good. The other thing about this is that there's a sort of inherent incentive for the guy in the number 2 spot to maybe encourage an accident for the guy in the first spot, right? So you're vice president, you say, wait a minute, the only thing that's keeping me from being president is this guy, falling down a well somewhere. And he was my political rival. That gives me an idea. So they said, this probably isn't a very good way to do it. And it was fixed very early in our republic, very early in our democracy here through the 12th Amendment. You can Google that and learn all about that. So basically, the vice president's job is really kind of been no big deal until it becomes a big deal. As that's what happened with about 8 of our U.S. presidents who have left office, let's just say, before their term was up. 4 of them by dying naturally in office, 4 of them by being sadly assassinated, and that's also resignation, of course, with President Nixon resigning and then President Ford becoming president. What was very interesting about Vice President Ford is, how like sometimes you call the king or the queen your excellency. Well, you could call Gerald Ford kind of your accidency, because it was kind of by accident that he became president. So here's another one of those little bar bets you can do. What president was president without ever being elected? Gerald Ford, right? He was appointed to be the vice president after Spiro Agnew had that little memory problem, where he kept forgetting to pay his taxes every year. And then he got caught on that. He resigned. Ford was taken from the House by Nixon and asked to be vice president. He became vice president, and then shortly thereafter, Nixon resigned and Ford became president. And then when he ran in 76, Gerald Ford narrowly lost to Jimmy Carter. So Ford was one of these guys that was president, but never actually was elected president. By the way, I'm mentioning these presidents. If you want to know more about these guys, visit your local presidential library. And if you can't do that in actuality, in the flesh, you can certainly do it virtually. Now, the vice presidency is a good stepping stone to the White House for a lot of folks, right? So if you go and you serve as vice president and you do a nice job, and then the president, runs through their 2 terms, that puts you in a really good position to be the nominee for the next presidential cycle. Doesn't always work that way. It doesn't always work that way, but that's a good place to get started and a good way to do that. And historically, the modern vice presidency is really kind of seen with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter actually would have Walter Mondale, his vice president, sit in on some of the national security meetings, some of the cabinet meetings, and those sorts of things, so that in the event something happened to Jimmy Carter, Vice President Mondale would be up to speed on what was going on. So we can thank Jimmy Carter for sort of the more modern vice presidency. But Before we get to talking about Harry Truman, whose birthday it is, happy birthday, Harry, we are going to talk a little bit about the other two guys that were vice president before before Harry Truman became vice president and then ascended into the presidency. And the first of those guys is a guy by the name of John Nance Garner, and that's him right there. This guy was the first vice president of Franklin Roosevelt, and he was a West Texas Democrat who had actually very little formal education, and he worked his way up to being vice president by taking the Texas law bar exam, and he passed that and became a lawyer, which is interesting because FDR also passed the bar exam without finishing his courses and became a lawyer. Then, after he became a lawyer, he was elected to be a judge. And in some of those Western states out there, when you say you're a judge, what that means is when you're elected to be a judge, you're not elected to be a judge like ordering the court, but you're actually elected to be more of an administrator, kind of like a county executive sort of a thing. And he worked his way up to becoming that. And then he ran for the House of Representatives. And he was there in 1898. So we're talking a long time ago. And then from there, he went to the Congress in 1902. Now, he was a Texas Democrat. And in those days, Texas Democrats were kind of like Republicans in a lot of ways. So he was a very conservative Democrat, and we'll talk about that just a little bit here. Now, because he was in the House of Representatives, he rode the seniority system, which was basically the longer you're there, the higher you move up, and he eventually worked his way up to being Speaker of the House in 1931. Now, this made him a national figure, right? He was third in line for the presidency by being Speaker of the House. And so he said, well, I'm Speaker of the House. Maybe I'll look for a promotion and I'll try to become president. So having never really accomplished anything administratively or legislatively, he decided to run for the presidency. And he got a boost from William Randolph Hearst, you know, the newspaper guy, who backed him. Hearst was a pretty conservative guy, and he backed him for president. So he got a bit of a boost with that. And what ended up happening was he was in the running in the Democratic convention that year, but he didn't have enough delegates to put him over the top. So what he did was he made a bargain with Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt said, listen, you guys, here's what we'll do. You throw your support to me, I'll make you vice president. And it was by doing that on the third ballot that FDR got the votes that he needed to become the Democratic nominee in 1932. And true to his word, he kept Garner on as the vice president. Now, Garner was as I said, a conservative Democrat. He was not much of a supporter of the New Deal, but he was a team player. He was an old school politician, and he kept his word, and he was a loyal vice president. You know, the deal was, I get you the delegates, you get me the job. All right, you're president, do what you want to do, and I'm not going to get in your way. I'm not going to undercut you in any way. But as he was vice president through the two terms of Franklin Roosevelt, he became less and less enamored with the New Deal. And in 1937, when President Roosevelt initiated what some people like to call court packing, all right, court packing. Around here, we like to call it the Legislative Judicial Reorganization Act. But when he wanted to try to have other justices added to the court, that was the end for Garner. He said, "Listen, no, I don't go for that. You know, now you're stretching too far," and so that's what he ended up beginning to do. The other problem was that the Democratic Party began to tilt more toward black voters throughout the two first terms of Franklin Roosevelt, and Garner was not popular among black voters. So by 1939, 1940, at the end of the first two terms of the Roosevelt administration, Garner said, you know what, I've had enough. I don't really want to do this anymore. And he was replaced by Henry Wallace. And this was pretty much done by mutual agreement, right? Wallace said, all right, yeah, I'd like to try out for that. And Garner was like, okay, I've had enough. Now, Garner went back to Texas and he built a fortune in real estate, ranching, and banking. And interestingly enough, he lived to be 99 years old. And he died in 1967. So he went on to have a very successful business career, having been vice president. Now, what are you going to do for the third term? Well, we've still got to have a vice president. And so what happens is along comes Henry Wallace. And here is a picture of him right there. Okay. And Henry Wallace ends up being FDR's third vice president. And here's how this works with this. So Wallace comes from a very well-respected farming dynasty out in Iowa. His father had served as the Secretary of Agriculture under the Harding-Coolidge administration from 1921 to 1924. And his grandfather had started a family newspaper business called Wallace's Farmer, which had a very large following among farmers, right? So it was this nice little magazine, newspaper type of thing that had all kinds of interesting articles for people that were interested in farming. And when Henry graduated from the Iowa State University College in 1910, he went to work for Grandpa at the paper, and he became of the Wallace Farmer. So what this did was it gave him a lot of exposure to farmers. It gave him a lot of exposure to what was going on in farming at the time. And because he was head of the editorial section, he was able to make his opinions known. He was able to, let people know what he was thinking about the advances and the things that were going on in farming. And he got involved in the Equality for Agriculture movement. And of course, this was a movement that was there to promote farmers, right? And to promote the issues and needs of farmers. My grandma grew up on a farm, and she always used to say, you can say whatever you want about a farmer, just don't say it with your mouth full, right? Because the stuff you're chewing is the stuff that they provided for you. So that was kind of the idea behind this. So he becomes pretty well known. He's an advocate for equality in farming. He also begins to get interested in the production of hybrid corn. And so he is sort of a leading advocate for that as well. And what ends up happening is he gains this reputation, but a man of action and a man of ideas. And this is what leads him to be tapped by Franklin Roosevelt, right, the guy over there, for the vice presidency in the third term. First, Roosevelt appoints him to be Secretary of Agriculture in the administration, and then Wallace, who had been a Republican, by the way, but had switched over as he was becoming more liberalized through this farm movement and such. He brings the Republican Iowan-type farmers over to the Democratic side as well. Now, Wallace was a complicated guy. He was one of these guys that could be both idealistic, right, sort of pie in the sky, but also very intellectual, right, very, Spock-like, just the facts sort of a thing. And this is an interesting contrast in someone. He also could be very hard-boiled about things. Once he made up his mind and decided on things, that was it. But at the same time, he could be very flexible about things. And what this did was it made him a very complex and sort of complicated guy to try and figure out. And the whole Jeffersonian, principles of American agriculture and American rural life. But he was also very fearful of over-industrialization and urbanization. But he realized that was kind of the wave of the future. So he had a very carefully crafted and very complex set of programs that helped farmers, but at the same time also helped industrial workers by making farm products affordable, and thereby allowing them access to food and farmers access to file, and his influence to presidential timber. And again, that was part of the reason why Roosevelt decided to pick him for the third term. He saw Wallace as a very natural and a very effective prospect to have on the ticket. And some folks by this point, though, were beginning to wonder about Wallace. Although some folks saw him as presidential timber, some people saw him as too complex for the job. Some folks also saw him as too much of a New Dealer, and that will be the thing that ends up sort of sinking his career later on at the end of the third term, nationalist. And so to have him on the ticket for the third term, there was a little bit of controversy there because Roosevelt was a New Dealer, Roosevelt was an internationalist, and folks were thinking, well, does that really balance out the ticket? But FDR wanted him on the ticket, and in fact, FDR said, if he's not the vice presidential nominee, I don't want the nomination. And that's what ended up putting the pressure on, and Wallace was accepted. Now, over the course of the third, increasingly too liberal, increasingly, too progressive, the tenor in the country begins to become more conservative. Each time FDR runs for election or the midterm elections, he's gaining less and less Democratic seats. People are saying, of course, they in the 1932 election because at that point, right? Herbert Hoover happened to be a heck of a guy. And again, you can learn more about him by visiting, which is out there yourself. Gets blamed for the Wallace as kind of problematic and a little too liberal, a little too progressive. But by this point, Wallace really sees himself as president. Timber. And so he wants to do this for the fourth term. Now, at this point, FDR is becoming ill. He is, been president now for 12 years. He is tired. He's fighting a world war. He's thinking about what's the world order going to be after the world war. And whereas he was willing to fight for Wallace to be on the ticket for the third term, he wasn't willing to expend the energy for the fourth term. So Wallace starts his own little campaign for this, and he rallies his supporters at the convention. They even went so far as to bribe the organist to play the Iowa song. The Iowa song, "Hail Iowa, oh Iowa, we hail you, Iowa." I'm pretty sure that's how it goes. Anyway, they kept playing this over and over to gin up support for Wallace, and it got to the point where they actually threatened to cut the tubes on the organ with an axe if they didn't stop. He also flooded the floor with fake tickets for delegates so that he could get more of his Wallace supporters into the convention center. It got to the point where officials had to shut down the convention because there were about 35,000 people in the building that was designed to hold 25,000. The next day, when folks came back and they got the ticket thing sorted out and it reopened, Truman was able to take the nomination over here, coming onto the ticket. Now, enter Harry Truman, whose birthday we celebrate today. In the weeks leading up to the Democratic National Convention, a great deal of speculation was building about who would be number 2 on the ticket. People were beginning to see, well, Roosevelt's starting to look like he's not looking so good. This wasn't highly addressed. The administration played it down. He's up to the job. Don't worry about it. Everything will be fine. And although FDR still favored Wallace, the party people thought he'd become too progressive. And as I said a moment ago, FDR was not up to putting up a fight for Wallace. So FDR put out a very lukewarm support statement for Wallace. And what this did was it gave the party officials the green light to start looking for somebody else. So FDR was like, yeah, I'd like to have Wallace, but, not that much, and we'll see, and it wasn't quite as blatant as that. But the idea was it gave the green light to the party. Basically, FDR is saying, look, I'd like to have Wallace. If you guys don't think it's any good, you find me somebody that we can have on there. And that is exactly what they decided to do. So they floated the idea of South Carolina Senator James Burns, and he was kind of seen as the odds-on favorite, and FDR was pretty supportive of him. But the problem with Burns was, number one, he was Catholic, right? So everybody was afraid, we want to elect a Catholic, then we'll have the Vatican running things. That doesn't dissipate until the 1960 election with President Kennedy. And then we also had the fact that he was unpopular with black votes, and he was also unpopular with the labor movement. And if I'm breaking up, as I see in the chat here, I'm sorry about that. There must be a lot of... So, James black voters and not having support of the labor movement. They said, how about Alan Barkley? He was floated, but he was considered to be too old Alvin Barkley. What about Judge William O? He was considered to be too young. And so they came up with this idea of Harry Truman. So the problem with Harry Truman, candidate, but there was one little problem with him, and that was want the job. There was even mention of the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, as a possible run for the presidency. But what the party did was the party chose Truman. And this happened as sort of what they called the Missouri Compromise. Right? One guy's too old, one guy's too young, one guy's too liberal. One guy, is a Speaker of the House. Who are we going to have? Let's pick Truman. He will be a good compromise candidate. He was loyal to the New Deal, but he was not seen as a radical New Dealer. He was not rich. He was someone who could appeal to ordinary people, and he had made a name for himself with a thing called the Truman Committee. And the Truman Committee was a committee that was run through the Senate during World War II. And his job was to use his committee to go around and rifle out waste and fraud in the munitions industry, about 15 the military industries. So this made him, sort of a good guy candidate as such. And the problem was, though, he's still brilliant bit of political theater. He was kind of pushed into the job. Truman was called to a meeting with the party leaders. And while the party leaders were meeting, President Roosevelt was going to be on the phone. And he, on the phone, asked, did you get the support of Truman to be on the ticket yet? And the party member said, no, we haven't, Mr. President. This guy is as stubborn as a Missouri mule. And with that, FDR then boomed into the phone, knowing that Truman was at the meeting and would hear this. he boomed into the phone, "Well, you tell the senator that if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's his responsibility." And Truman heard this, and of course, he knew he was trapped by a sense of duty. And that's how he accepted the nomination for the presidency. It happened on the second ballot. He defeated Wallace with over 1,000 votes. Wallace came in a relatively close second with 926, but Truman had it sewn up. President, on my back. The rest, as they say, is history. He ended up Roosevelt was suffering some health issues, and he was preoccupied with the war. He was preoccupied with what was going to happen after the war was over. So Truman did the bulk of the campaigning that year, and they ended up, of course, winning. Now they win, and in the time between the inauguration in January and Roosevelt's passing on April 12th, 1945, they meet only a handful of times. Remember, this is back in the time when, the vice president, what's your job? Sit in the Senate and, lord over the Senate, although you didn't really because the majority leader did, and call the White House every day and see how the president is doing. And what ended up happening was on April 12th, 1945, Harry Truman, right? Good old Harry Truman was in the Senate, and he had been writing. He had finished the letter. He went out to, the session wrapped up. He went out to mail the letter, and then he headed over to Sam Rayburn. They would go over to his office for a shot of bourbon at the end of the day. So the call comes in, where's the vice president? Well, we're not really sure because he was mailing that letter. And then they leave a message at Rayburn's office, knowing he's going to eventually end up there. And they say, hey, when you get there, call the White House right away. So Truman gets there. They say, oh, there's a message, call the White House. He calls the White House, and Steve Early, the president's press secretary, says, you got to get over here right away. Now, in Truman's mind, he's thinking, oh, something good might have happened, right? What? But maybe the war's over, right? Maybe Hitler, surrender. Maybe the war is. Maybe Hitler surrendered. Maybe it's done, right? He was all excited about this, but he could tell by the tone of Steve Early's voice that the message was not a good one. So he goes over to the White House. He goes in the entrance that Steve Early had told him to go into. He's taken up to the second floor to the residence. He walks in. There is members of the Roosevelt administration, and there is Mrs. Roosevelt. And she says very straightforward, very bluntly, very matter-of-factly, Harry, the president, is dead. And of course, he's in shock, right? He's thinking, well, maybe there's something good going on here, but maybe there's not, but he certainly wasn't prepared to hear that. So he collects himself for a moment and he says to Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you or your family? And Mrs. Roosevelt steps closer to him, puts her arm around him and says, Harry, is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now. And that's how he became president of the United States. And he was sworn in around about 7 o'clock that evening, Eastern wartime. Now let's compare Franklin Roosevelt to Harry Truman, because this is really kind of interesting, right? If you had to have somebody to follow you in office, who's going to fill the shoes of Franklin Roosevelt? And one of the first things I'd like to compare is their attitudes upon taking office. So their opening words are this: Franklin Roosevelt, right? Franklin Roosevelt comes to power during the Great Depression. 25% unemployment, 25% underemployment, suicide rate has tripled, U.S. Steel is essentially out of business, the stock market has crashed, and he steps to the microphone and he says, The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Total 100% confidence. I got this. I know things are bad, but I'm going to make it happen here, and we are going to get this country back on track. When Harry Truman becomes president, at his first press conference, he says to the reporters, "Boys, I don't know if you ever pray, but if you do, pray for me. I don't know if you've ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me yesterday that I was president, I felt like the sun, the moon, and all the stars fell on me." So here is a guy who was clearly overwhelmed by now having to become president. And why wouldn't you be? You've only been vice president for 82 or 83 days. You don't know anything about what went on at Yalta. You don't know anything about the atomic bomb. You know very little about what was going on in the administration other than pretty much what you were reading in the newspaper. You knew just maybe a little more than the average person. Now, all of a sudden, bingo, the job is yours. And this from a guy who was not born in the bedroom of his family's mansion in Hyde Park, New York, but in fact was born on a dirt farm 140 years ago today. He was not an only child who was pampered and spoiled like Franklin Roosevelt. He was the guy who had a brother and a sister and lived in a small, tight-knit farm community. He was not a guy who was tutored by European tutors at home until he was 14 and then went to a prestigious sleepaway school, Groton School, and then on to Harvard, and then on to Columbia. He was the guy who went to the Jackson County Public Schools, and the highest education he ever achieved, old Harry Truman, was a high school education. He wanted to get into West Point, but he wasn't able to do it because his eyes were too bad, right? He even went so far as to try to memorize the eye chart, but it didn't work. He was not a student that got B's and C's, gentlemen B's and gentlemen C's at Harvard, the way some people may have done, right? He was not a B and C student. He was mostly an A and B student. And when I make these comparisons, I'm not in any way trying to run down President Roosevelt. I'm simply trying to create the comparison and the contrast between the two so you can get an idea of what people at that time felt like they were getting. Job history. President Roosevelt had been a state senator. He had been the assistant secretary of the Navy. He had been a lawyer. He had been the governor of New York, and he became president of the United States. Job history. Harry Truman was a soda jerk in Independence. He was a failed haberdasher. He was a dirt farmer until the age he was 30. Until he was 30 years old. He ran and became a county judge, like an administrator. He then went from that to being a United States senator, to being vice president, a job he didn't even want, only for 82 days, and then he becomes president. Defining moment in this guy's life, contraction of polio, right? When he suddenly realized, wow, I can't walk. By no fault of my own, I am paralyzed in what it is that I want to do. And this was a great way for him to get a sense of what people during the Great Depression felt, because they, by no sense and no fault of their own, had a sense of hopelessness and were paralyzed in what it was that they wanted to do. Also, this guy's defining moment was when he was a captain in World War I. He was the captain of an infantry unit, and it was the first time that he was really successful at anything. It was the first time that he really was showing any kind of leadership skills and abilities to do that. Harry Truman rose every morning at 5:30 in the morning. He would read books cover to cover, and he would write in the margins notes and ideas about what he was reading. And he liked to have a little shot of bourbon before he went to bed at night. Franklin Roosevelt would rise somewhere between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, stay in bed for the first hour or so, right, which was more comfortable because of the polio. He would read the newspapers from around the country, find out what was going on in the world. He was a book collector, but a spot reader, very rarely reading a book from beginning to end, but just picking out the parts that were interesting to him. And he would have children's hour at around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and that was when he would have his cocktails in the afternoon. In terms of their professional habits, Harry Truman was very decisive. He was very centralized. He was tight about his ways of thinking, and he sought the advice of many people. He understood that he didn't have the college education that a lot of people around him had, and so he sought their advice. President Roosevelt, in his professional habits, tended to be a little bit looser. He was very often indecisive until forced into a decision. He would sort of let things hang and see if they would work their way out. He was very decentralized in the way he went about things. He would very often put numerous people to work on the same task to see who would come up with the best idea, those sorts of things. And he was very close in keeping his own tight, close counsel. He had a small group of people who were, sort of his advisors, his inner circle, and he depended upon them, but not a large circle of people that way. President Harry Truman had a wife that was very shy, very private. In fact, she spent much time in Missouri as opposed to the White House. President Truman would wear 2 watches, one with Washington time and the other with Missouri time, so he would get a sense of what Bess was doing back in Missouri. Of course, but she was actively involved in being, of course, was rich. He had to use a wheelchair to get at the great fire, to be sort of cocky or confident or arrogant or, jaunty, as well. And Harry to the middle class in large measure by marrying his wife. The Wallace family was pretty well-to-do in Missouri. And he was very active. One of the first shocking things for reporters and members of the staff after he took over the presidency was that he would burst into a room. President Roosevelt wasn't able to do that. President Roosevelt was usually seated at the room, in the room already when people got there, because he was in the wheelchair and didn't like to, look having to be shuffled around and that sort of stuff. But Truman would burst in, Truman would walk in, and suddenly there was this action and such. Truman tended to talk in a sort of way which was not very appealing to people in the fireside chats, but it was very genuine. It was very sincere. Truman had sort of a subtle confidence. He was steadfast, almost to the point of being stubborn. And he was very self-aware of himself and was really kind of a down-to-earth sort of a guy. People sometimes said that rose to people, and that's the way they went through. Now, in terms of public service, they couldn't have been more the same. They both believed that it was a duty to serve. They both believed that government could and should help the people in their daily lives. They were both New Dealers. In terms of their worldview, again, nearly identical. They both believed that the United States should have a leadership role in the world. They both believed that we needed to be defenders of freedom around the world. And they both believed in the basic principles of democracy, and they both believed in the need for a world body, a world organization to prevent a third world war. That is why Harry Truman, in one of his very first decisions, decided to go ahead with the conference for the United Nations. President Roosevelt had worked very diligently to set up the United Nations. He was getting ready to address the conference at the end of April in 1945, and of course he passes on April 12th. So Truman says, Roosevelt believed in this, I believe in this, we're going to go ahead with that conference, and that's exactly what they did. People were so shocked that this guy became president, that there was a story about one of the administration was meeting with President Truman, and President Truman said, well, here's what we're going to do about this particular problem. And the staff member said, did the president make that decision before he died? Meaning, of course, Roosevelt, right? And Harry Truman said, no, the president made that decision right here, right now. I'm the president, remember? And he wasn't taken aback by that in an insulting kind of a way. He understood that Roosevelt had been president for so long that people couldn't understand or remember or even conceive of a time without Roosevelt being president. But he was also very sure about the fact that he needed people to know that he was now the president. Throughout the remainder of Roosevelt's term, he pretty much followed Roosevelt's policies. He had a little bit of trouble with Stalin because Stalin was beginning to backpedal on some of his agreements that he had done at Yalta. Truman sort of underestimated Stalin a little bit. He sort of saw Stalin as a kind of a Tom Pendergast, an old political machine kind of a guy, and he thought he'd be able to work with him on that. But of course, Stalin was an untrustworthy partner, for a whole lot of reasons. And so their approach was a little bit different from that perspective. And whereas good old FDR was good buds with Winston, and he said, we'll get along okay, so long as he doesn't try to soft soap me and suck up to me too much. And that's what Winston Churchill was looking to do. So Harry Truman, happy birthday. He carries on the policies and the work of President Roosevelt. He sees out the winning of the World War. He sees out the setup of the United Nations, and he begins to help rebuild Europe. This guy becomes president at probably the most critical time in world history. Within 4 months of this guy becoming president, the world vastly changes. We have the defeat of Nazi Germany. The United Nations is created. The Japanese bombing of the Japanese homeland begins in earnest. The Nazi death camps are discovered and liberated and brought to public knowledge. And we end up dropping the atomic bomb. We enter on the plate of a man who was at the table of the vice presidency for simply 82 or 83 days, depending on how you count it. This is the guy, the man from Missouri, who stepped into the huge, gigantic, monumental, historic shoes of Franklin Roosevelt and was able to grow into them and was able to successfully carry out the job. When Truman becomes president, the first question everybody asks is, Harry who? Within about 6 months of being president, his approval ratings are in the 60s and the 70s. He was considered a shoe out when he ran for his own term for president in 1948, because as opposed to a shoe in, right? So he comes in, Harry who? 6 months later, he's got 60 or 70% approval ratings. By the end of his first term, people think he's a disaster. And they think, oh, Dewey's going to beat this guy. He travels all across the country with his whistle-stop campaign, and he convinces people that he is the guy for the job. When he finally ends his presidency, he ends as a humble and somewhat defeated man. He's not is not seen as the great president that he will be seen as history begins to evaluate his presidency. And in fact, he ends up going to the train station, Union Station in Washington, gets on the train as an ordinary citizen, goes back to Missouri, spends the rest of his life building his presidential library. He passes away at the age of 88 on December 26, 1972, and has since become considered one of our most decisive and most effective presidents. Certainly a good balance, a good person to have followed. Franklin, a lot of great and a lot of good for this country and this world. So on Harry Truman's birthday, I would like to say thank you to both of these fellas for the great job that they did in getting us through the Great Depression, the Second World War, and setting up the World Organization of the United Nations since that time. Happy birthday, Harry Truman. And we're remembering you on this important day. Thanks. Let's see. Researching at the library, I came across the White House log that showed the minute-by-minute sequence of events from the FDR passing to Truman being sworn in to Eleanor on site. Archival importance. Yes, very interesting. The way that this worked, and a very incredible moment in history. Think about it, right? You talk about the peaceful transfer of power. There it was, right? One guy's dead, the next guy's still alive, pick up the work, go on. People couldn't imagine a time when President Roosevelt had not been president. Harry Truman steps into that, and he continues the job and does the job started so successfully, building on the success of President Franklin Roosevelt, who had him be his fourth term. Comments for videos. I would do that, but I don't know what that means, Doug. So there you go. Interesting. Boy, it sure is, isn't it? And by talking about vice presidents, it gives you an opportunity to have your interest piqued in some of the other presidential libraries, and you can go and find out more information from those folks as well. Why was the quality so crazy on this? I don't know. It's just internet issues. There's a lot of folks out there using the internet, and we're competing with those folks as well. All right, so I don't see any other questions coming in. So I will allow you, it's almost 3 o'clock here on the East Coast. So this will allow you to finish up a little early. You can get out there. It's still not too late to get an ice cream cake, bring it home to your family, and say, hey, guess what? We're celebrating Harry Truman's 140th birthday today. So you still got time to become part of the celebration. Oh, Ed asks, had Truman succumbed not long after being sworn in, who would have succeeded him? Ooh, that's a very good question. The way that works is this. What would have happened is then it would have gone to the Speaker of the House, who is third in line for the presidency, and that would have been because of the Speaker of the House is of the majority party, and of the majority party of the largest number of people. The House of Representatives represents the largest number of folks. And then what approved by the Senate 25th Amendment, it's clarified beyond that even. And so then, because that was after the assassination of President Kennedy, and the question was, well, what do we do if a guy takes a head injury and is not dead, but is not able to be, president? And what if there's a conspiracy and they take out the whole, group? That was the idea behind some of these assassinations, right? With Lincoln was assassinated, they also attacked the Secretary of War. There was a little conspiracy with that. So in order to clarify the line of succession, the 25th Amendment then sets it up to go through the House, to the House of Representatives, to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, then to the President pro tem, and then it works its way down through the cabinet, starting with the Secretary of State. Now, people say, well, what about when what was that guy, Henry Kissinger, right? He wasn't an American citizen. Could he have been president? Well, they would have gone from him to the next guy or gal in the cabinet at that point. So it goes all the way down. When you watch the State of the Union addresses, they'll sometimes talk about the dedicated survivor. That is one member of the president's cabinet that is asked to stay at home so that if the building collapses or there's a gas leak or something, who knows, right? And the entire government is wiped out, they will still have one member of the cabinet. Then the presidency would go to that person. So that's who the designated survivor is. So the 25th Amendment, I believe it is, lays out the succession from there so that there can't be a whole lot of questions and comments and that sort of stuff. If you remember back to when President Reagan the attempt was made on President Reagan's life back in 1981. President Reagan was in Washington. He was shot. He was taken to the hospital. They weren't sure about the whereabouts of Vice President George Bush at that time. They weren't able to, I think he was back in Texas and was away from the phone. And if you remember, Secretary of State, what was his name there? Alexander Haig steps to the podium in the White House and says, oh, the president's been shot. We're trying to locate the vice president here in the White House. I'm in charge. That scared a lot of people because it was like, wait a minute, you're not in line for the presidency. Not yet. It's got to go through 2 more people before it gets to you. And so there was like a little bit of like, oh my gosh, if the Secretary of State is standing there saying, here in the White House, I'm in charge, has there been a coup? Has he taken over the government? And of course, what he meant was we are locating the vice president. In the meantime, things are under control here in the White House. But that's not what he said. He said, here in the White House, I'm in charge. So you can go back and take a look at that. What was Eleanor Roosevelt's relationship with Truman during his presidency? Friendly? Not so friendly? Well, Harry Truman was a smart guy, and one of the first things he did was wrap himself in the mantle of Mrs. Roosevelt's legacy. He appointed her to be one of the delegates to the United Nations, and he knew that she had the Roosevelt mantle, the Roosevelt, aura that would help the United Nations get off the ground. And he was very friendly toward her. She was very friendly toward him. And they were sort of kindred spirits in the sense that they both believed in government being able to help folks. Now, what happened, though, of course, is when you become president, you suddenly have to answer to a large number of constituents. And he was not moving fast enough and pushing forward enough on civil rights for Mrs. Roosevelt. And so there was some tension and some friction there. And in fact, she was withholding support for his second run, for his first run, Harry Truman's first run on his own, after the term of President Roosevelt had finished up. She was holding back support on that until he made some concessions to say, yes, I will be more proactive in civil rights. So they were a team. They were together. They were on it. But she was not afraid to keep his feet and hold his feet to the fire, just as she had done with President Roosevelt. Okay, so I would say that it was mostly friendly, but it was understood that he needed to listen to that voice, had to hear that voice, but he was limited in what he could do sometimes due to the political realities. Mrs. Roosevelt did not have to deal with those political realities, and so that's where the relationship was in terms of that. Anything else? Okie dokie. So now we're just about at 3 o'clock. Still time to get those ice cream cakes. So run out there and treat your family to a Harry Truman 140th birthday. Thank you. He was our fourth term vice president, third vice president of President Roosevelt, the guy that finished the job. And we will see you again very soon here on our websites here and our social media sites. And in the meantime, come visit the library. We've got our annual come and visit, come see us. And if in the meantime, visit us online, visit the other presidential libraries online, and you can learn a heck of a lot about what it takes to do the job of being president. We'll see you next time.